Thank you, Pamela. I first came to the Institute as a member in 1986. At that time, I was categorized as a young scholar. That's pertinent because fast forward 30 years and a few months from now, I'll be retiring, which is to say my university will stop paying me. I'll lose my research assistant, but I'll have 20 years of research still in hand that I need to make some progress on. I mentioned being here 30 years ago because at that time it was a very difficult time in British universities for people in my subject area. A number of entire departments in classics and classical archaeology were shut down, and quite a number of my colleagues at the time, some still fairly young, just started on their careers, lost their jobs, were made redundant and never managed to make a career in the subject. I'm convinced that the experience I had here in 1986, this year that I had at the Institute, what I was able to do at that time was tremendously influential in, first of all, safeguarding my career so that I did actually have a job to go back to when I left here, and in helping promote it in the years that followed, so that I've spent my entire career from my 20s right through now till my late 60s in the subject without a break. The work that I came here to do in 1986 was to write a chapter for the Cambridge Ancient History. The second edition was coming out at that time. It takes about 20 years for all the volumes to be updated. That was influential, and the circumstances in which I was working here, of course, were the ideal ones. But shortly after coming here as well, I thought of a book that I could write, and I did that at the same time that I was here. And I think that in some ways was even more useful in helping safeguard my career. So I look back on that year that I had over 30 years ago as one that's been hugely important. And of course, anybody who's been here as a member will recognize the ideal circumstances in which one undertakes research here, the tranquility, the marvelous resources of the library and the institute, the university nearby, and of course the very stimulating colleagues that you have here, both fellow members and the permanent members of the faculty, not least Glenn Bowersock, who was at that time working very precisely in the same area that I was on the Near East. So the Institute's been somewhere that's been with me for over 30 years, and I'm very grateful to have this opportunity today to talk to you about one of the things that's been in my research portfolio in recent years. And I should explain that despite what Pamela said about my being a Roman archaeologist, it's perfectly true. That has been the love of my life since I was about 12. But in recent years, I've discovered something else, which is what I'm going to be talking to you about today. And that's something that stems from my interest in aerial archaeology, but it's prehistory. This is your chance to leave if you came along thinking you're going to be hearing about Roman archaeology. Much of what I'm going to be talking about today is not just prehistory, but deep prehistory, some of it going back about 9,000 years, so 7,000 years before the Romans arrived in the Near East. I thought I'd begin with a question. Many audience I put this up for, academic audience, will know who this is. I just wondered if anybody here recognizes who this is in the photograph. No, good. That's what I was hoping. It's Gertrude Bell. Is the name familiar to any of you? Amongst other things, she's often credited with being the architect of Iraq. Now, that may or may not be a good thing at the moment to put on her CV, but she was instrumental, I believe, in persuading the British government at the time to bring together the three Turkish provinces, three Ottoman provinces, into what is now Iraq. But as you can see, if you look at a sort of brief biography of her, she's described as writer, traveller, political officer, administrator, archaeologist, and spy. And I suspect that's what she was doing in December 1913 when she undertook a trip. About the middle of December, she set off from Damascus, and she walked and rode. She often walked beside her camels rather than riding them. She walked southeast from Damascus down across this great lava field that stretches to the south and southeast of Damascus. She walked down towards this little watering hole at Kasaburku over there, and then she continued, but now southwest, down to the Azraq Oasis, which is the second biggest oasis in the Syrian desert. The Syrian desert is this whole area north of the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. And the Azraq Oasis is second only to Palmyra as an oasis. So she was walking across this area beside her camels and then down to the Azraq Oasis. It took her about 2 weeks. And she's almost certainly the first Westerner to travel that deeply into this lava field. certainly the first woman to do so, and I suspect that given the date, December 1913, just a few months before the outbreak of the First World War, it was part of her portfolio of finding out about parts of the Ottoman Empire in anticipation of the war that people were beginning to see on the horizon. Now, as she travelled, she was an inveterate note-taker. She kept a diary, she kept a journal, she wrote letters every evening as she sat down and then would post the letters when she got to somewhere that she could send them back to her family or to friends. And she took photographs and made sketches so that almost all of this has survived. It's at the University of Newcastle in Britain. So you can see what she was actually writing down day by day as she went along. Now, I mention all of this because as she went along, she, despite archaeologist being one of her titles, as you saw in that brief bio there, she has virtually nothing to say about archaeology as she goes along. She makes this extensive trip, 2 weeks, and the only things that she mentions as she goes along the way are the handful of Roman sites and early Islamic sites. There's about 5 of them that she mentions, and she mentions as well seeing graffiti and rock art on some of the stones that she's passing, a few of which she records. Now, she is, so I have to resort to the low-tech method since my pointer won't work on the screen. As she came down here, she's passing through an area of this lava field. That's approximately her route for just this little bit in the middle there. And as you can see from all of my yellow pins, today, the work we've been doing on identifying archaeological sites in that area, we've found hundreds just in that small area. So she's actually walking through all of these and was oblivious to them. She only saw the rock graffiti occasionally, and the major Roman military sites that she saw were at Burku and just down here at Azrak and just before you reach Azrak. Otherwise, she mentions none of this. So the sort of things she was seeing are what you see here. She's traveling through this area. This brings her down to Casa Burku, where there's a small Roman and early Islamic site, and some of the rock art that she would have seen along the way. The inscription on it is usually called Safayetic, from the name of the region in which it is found. And this is the sort of landscape that she'll be walking through day after day for these 2 weeks. It's bitterly cold in December. She mentions at one point that she had to break the ice on the water in order to brush her teeth in the morning. You can see that there are things in the landscape, but by and large it looks like this. Black basalt volcanic boulders. The lichen on the surface here is an indicator that they've been in that position for a long time. There's all this weathering on the surface. But here and there, some of them have been turned over. And she would have noticed these, I'm sure, that there were places where a few stones had been heaped up, that it was something man-made. It's not the natural landscape that you see around there. Something else over here, something on the crest up there. But otherwise, she doesn't mention anything at all. She would have seen this but been not thought it worth mentioning. At ground level, it isn't worth mentioning. It's very uninspiring, and it's extremely difficult to make any sense of what you see there. It's worth noting as well that almost all of these things that she would have noticed and that we can still see today are just some 18 inches, about 50 centimeters high. Just a few stones heaped on top of one another. They're not particularly impressive at all at ground level. All that was about to change. This is what she was seeing in December 1913. Less than a year later, First World War broke out, and within a matter of months, all of the belligerents in the First World War had flooded the area with aeroplanes. The first aeroplane had arrived in about the same time as Gertrude Bell is walking in 1913. The first aeroplane had arrived in Palestine and taken the first aerial photographs of an archaeological site in December 1913. A year later, there are hundreds of airplanes being flooded into the area, and very quickly the military realized how useful the aircraft were for reconnaissance, discovery, recording, mapping. Suddenly, the aircraft in the region were able to let people see from above things that were unintelligible at ground level. The real breakthrough in terms of archaeology for the region came in 1921 with the creation of the British Mandate of Transjordan and of Iraq, and the French Mandate of Syria up here. The British decided to open an airmail route between their existing colony, so to speak, in Egypt down here, and Basra across on the Gulf and onto India. So they blazed the trail for these great lumbering aircraft of the time, most of which couldn't manage much more than about 100 knots an hour. These great aircraft to cross the desert of Jordan into Iraq and then down to Ramadi and onto Basra. And it was the pilots of the airmail route who first started to note that they could see from the air things that were really very striking and which Gertrude Bell and other people on the ground had never been able to see, or if they'd seen them, they thought they weren't worth mentioning. So 1921 is an important date. It's when the first aircraft are operating along this airmail route across this basalt landscape, this volcanic landscape. And almost immediately, one of the pilots mentions that he could see things beneath. It was very strange in this landscape that, as you saw from those photographs, is extremely bleak. You wouldn't have thought that there would have been much interest for human beings in that area. And yet, suddenly this man, Popham, mentions that a peculiar thing about this lava country is that there are traces of some ancient civilization on it. There are several circles of lava blocks, which may very likely be the remains of houses. But in addition, there are straight walls, which from the air look like the boundaries between fields. You know, so already somebody's noticing that there's something very odd beneath them when you can see it from a few hundred feet up. When these RAF pilots asked the Bedouin who moved back and forth through this area what these structures were that they could see, these heaps of stones that were so uninspiring at ground level, the Bedouin said, oh, those are the works of the old men, or the works of the old people, which apparently to them meant they're nothing to do with us. We didn't build them. They are very old and they're pre-Islamic. Now, as it happens, they're correct. These are almost certainly not just pre-Islamic, but pre-Roman and several thousand years old. What they meant by the works of the old men are the things which today we give a variety of names to. The names have all been invented partly to make them rather colourless, you know, so as not to prejudge what these structures are actually for. But the first of them was a name that was invented by the RAF pilots, the sites that they call kites. Then we've got whales, pendants, there's cairns, meandering walls, and so on. We'll come to look at a few of those just in a moment. And there are thousands of them. As we saw from that previous picture where I showed Gertrude Bell walking across this landscape, we've put several thousand of these yellow pins now into Google Earth, showing where we can actually see one of these sites from the satellite imagery that is virtually unseen or certainly unintelligible at ground level. What in fact the RAF pilots had discovered was a huge prehistoric landscape, previously unknown. The few people who'd penetrated into this area, the few Westerners who penetrated into this area up to and including Gertrude Bell, had been completely unaware that there was this massive prehistoric landscape there stretching across this entire lava field from southern Syria, from near Damascus right down into northern Saudi Arabia. The real breakthrough came when one of them published an article from which I've shamelessly taken my title today. As you can see, Flight Lieutenant Maitland, Royal Air Force, wrote an article published in 1927 in the very first issue of the journal Antiquity called The Works of the Old Men in Arabia. And he published a number of photographs in there which for the first time showed scholars what the RAF pilots were seeing and brought to their attention just how numerous these structures were and how significant they were. There he is, there's Maitland in the middle with his huge lumbering, what had been a bomber during the First World War, but now converted to transporting a few passengers, cargo, and of course, above all, the airmail. He went on to be an Air Vice Marshal, and I had the pleasure of meeting his son, who lives just outside Oxford, just a couple of years ago, who's now himself in his 80s, and was completely unaware that his father had written this article, and that one of the more important prehistoric sites in the region is named for his father. It's still called Maitland's Monument. In fact, there are two. The second one is where his father crashed an airplane, and the remains of the airplane are still there, or were still there, to be marked on maps. Fast forward 50 years, and in 1978, I founded this archive, the Aerial Photographic Archive for Archaeology in the Middle East. I'm sorry, it's a bit of a mouthful, but it seemed like a good idea 30 years to give it that title. For 20 years, that consisted of finding old aerial photographs in archives and gathering together in my archive at the University of Sheffield, where I was at the time. But in the last 20 years, beginning in 1997, we've been carrying out our own program of aerial archaeology, actually flying in Jordan, and thanks to Prince Faisal, the current king's brother, who at the time was the commander of the Air Force and gave us permission and provided military helicopters. We've been flying there every year now for just over 20 years. This will be our 21st year in September this year. The result is we've put together this archive, which now has, I think, coming on for 120,000 photographs, mainly aerial, and almost entirely ones we've taken during the last 20 years of archaeological sites, many of which are in this volcanic lava field, which is why I'm stressing just how useful the archive is and our program of aerial photography. The sites that we've been identifying there, and which I'm going to be looking at both in this area of Jordan and then at some of these other lava fields further south, are the ones, I'm not going to go through them all, I've listed them all there and they're on the second page of your handout. I just want to look at the first 3 or 4 just to give you a flavour of what there is. And I point out the very last column there is rating. The work we've been doing has not been systematic or not entirely systematic, so that we think we've probably, in this lava field in the north, which stretches across southern Syria, Jordan, and into northern Saudi Arabia, we think that, well, we know that we've counted 2,590 kites. That's the first of the sites I want to look at. And I've given a rough rating. I think that's probably about 90% of what exists or once exists. Some of them have been destroyed. The next category are whales. Almost 3,500 of them, but I think we've only recorded just over half of those. There's an awful lot more work to do, and so on down the list. Kites are the only group of these sites that has been pretty systematically identified on the satellite imagery and on aerial photographs we're taking to produce a reliable count. As you can see, there's possibly getting on for 3,000 kites once existed in this single lava field. Just to illustrate what I mean, there's a kite. We give them all names according to the map square that they're in. So this is in the Safawi map square, and it's the 104th kite that we've identified in that square. You can see the very bleak black landscape it lies in, but you can also see just how substantial it is. It consists of a head down there, which is about 200 meters across, and it has to have at least 2 tails, 2 walls running out from it, but it can be much more than that. This case is at least 3 large ones. And you can see how long these tails are, 600, 900, and 1,300 meters long, running off in the landscape. And they create a funnel. I should explain that they're almost certainly animal traps. The idea was to move animals slowly towards where the killing area was, gradually having them funneled by these walls down into the head of what the pilots had called kites. Now, the reason they called them kites is that these RAF pilots flying over this area thought from the air these looked like a child's kite, a head with tails streaming out behind it. So the name has been taken up by archaeologists, and it's far too late now to come up with anything better, but it's a rather nice title anyway. That was a relatively simple one I just showed you. Some of them are extremely complex. So here we've got a palimpsest of kites with at least 2, possibly 3 kites on top of one another on slightly different alignments. So you get this multiplicity of tails coming out. And this is probably the original, sorry, the current head, the latest head there with the opening into the head itself. But there's an older one up here and possibly a third one over there. So in quite a number of areas we find these extremely complex kites. That's worth stressing because when we start to look at other lava fields, things are rather different. The second category I want to look at are wheels. And the title is, again, one we've invented for the obvious reason that in their ideal form, they look like that. An almost perfect circle, ring, a central hub, and walls that look like hubs. The spokes running out from the central hub, and sometimes with small cairns in the wedges created by that. They can come in a variety of shapes. That one's not quite so perfect. This one's rather squashed, and look, it's got little cairns around the outside, and so on. In this case, we've got about a dozen of these wheels side by side. And it's what led people to think that they must be houses. It's a village that you're looking at. It's almost certainly not the case, but that was what initial viewers thought. The wheels themselves can be between 20 and 50 millimeters in diameter. And the number of spokes varies, but there's usually at least 5 or 6 spokes inside each wheel. And once we've had a chance to look at some of the 3,500 that we've now catalogued, we can see that there's actually quite a variety from the sort of near perfect examples there to others that are more complex with a little ring of cairns outside, down to this one where there's not only a ring of cairns outside, but there's another wall beyond that still, and some that are rather squashed, so it's a bit difficult to think of them as wheels, but nevertheless the title's stuck. And the third type that I'm going to look at, and this is the last of them, is the pendant, where you have what is almost certainly a burial chamber under this cairn in the centre there. Then you have a ring outside, a low wall outside, and then you have a whole series of small cairns running out in what's usually a perfectly straight line from it. In this case, there's about 23 of these little cairns down there. They tend to collapse and fuse so that at times it looks as if it's just a continuous wall, but in practice it's a series of small cairns side by side. And sorry, there is one more. This is the meandering walls that you find all over the landscape in this area. You can see a whole string of them here. Almost impossible to work out what they're for. All over the landscape, and you can see that they are surrounding a kite. There's the tails of a kite coming in, and there's its head there. So the kite looks like it was already there. Then at a later stage, some of these walls were added and more and more. Now you can get an idea of just the scale of these. That's the Jordanian police post there, and there's a large water tanker. So that this is on a large scale, but at ground level, these people in this police post are completely unaware that any of this is there. They can see the stone scattered on the surface, but it makes absolutely no sense at ground level. It's only when you get up a few hundred feet you can see that there's something of a pattern to it. At best, these walls are still everywhere, only about 50 centimetres high, maybe sort of 16, 18 inches high. Now that's the first of the lava fields. That's the one where Maitland, flying his aircraft and publishing his article on the works of the old men, this is this lava field up there that stretches across the panhandle, the Jordanian panhandle there. So as you can see, there's a whole series of other lava fields in which you might expect to find the same kind of thing, stretching right the way down the west coast of Saudi Arabia, down into the Yemen down there, and indeed across into the Horn of Africa, into Eritrea, Djibouti, and so on, and across into Ethiopia. And in practice, almost all of these lava fields have revealed some structures that you can add to the category of works. Now, the problem for archaeologists is that Jordan is the only country outside Europe, not just the only one in the Middle East, it's the only one outside Europe in which you can do aerial photography. They actually provide us with a military helicopter each year, so that where the military can go, we can go. No other country allows it to be done. In the case of Saudi Arabia, they're even very reluctant to let you see old aerial photographs. So virtually everything we know about the archaeology of Saudi Arabia is from looking at it on the ground. Nevertheless, now we've got satellite imagery on Google Earth and on Bing. A lot of high-resolution imagery has been made available in recent years so that we can start to see the landscape of Saudi Arabia, including these lava fields, in a way that you couldn't do until even 10 years ago. And you don't have to ask the Saudis for permission. You can simply, anybody can look at it on their computers. All of these lava fields have revealed structures, but the two that I want to look at in particular are the ones I've arrowed, the Harat Khaybar there and the Harat Rahat down here. Because I've done a fair amount of work on those. I won't look at this in any detail, but this is just the counterpart of that table that I showed you before, which is on your handout, except that this time, instead of just the structures in the Jordanian lava field, I've looked at all the other ones as well. Now, we simply haven't had time to do more than look at a few small parts of these systematically and parts of others just rather randomly to get an impression of what is there. But we have looked in detail at the Harat Khaybar and the Harat Rahat, and there are some new site types turn up there, most of which you don't find in Jordan at all. So that they're plainly part of the same sort of grouping of sites that the Bedouin would call works. They're a type that are unique to particular lava fields. Now, when we compare kites, for example, in the Jordanian lava field, the Harat al-Sham, we've got 2,590 so far. In the case of the Harat Khaybar in Saudi Arabia, we counted just over 800, and then 19 in the Harat Rahat. That may sound as if Saudi Arabia's rather poor in terms of kites, and in terms of pure numbers, that's certainly true, but the pattern of them is rather different. In Saudi Arabia, in this particular lava field, they're grouped on either side of the lava field with nothing in the middle, unlike Jordan, where they're spread fairly evenly across the lava field. In Saudi Arabia, they're grouped on either side, and they're far denser there than anywhere else that we've encountered them. Now, the other thing that's peculiar about kites in Saudi Arabia, first of all, is that we have none of those very complex ones like the one I showed you for Jordan, with the palimpsest of kites one on top of the other. Nothing like that turns up in Saudi Arabia amongst these 800 we've found. The second feature is that we've got different shapes. So we've got one here that we've called the barbed kite, and you can perhaps see from the drawing of it why we've called it like that. These sort of series of straight lines coming to not quite a point, because it's got these little circles at either end, which we think were the hides where, well, initially it was thought these were hides where hunters hid, ready to jump up when the animals were trapped in the head. But now we think the hunters followed the animals into the head and would throw the animals into these little circles from which they couldn't get out again. We're talking about gazelle, which are about this size, as the commonest of the animals that they were probably hunting. So different types of kites in Saudi Arabia, and far denser than we find them in Jordan. We find whales as well, but they're very different from the ones we've seen in Jordan. Very simple ring, far fewer of them than we found in Jordan. We've got, as we saw, 3,500 already, and we've probably only counted just over half. In Saudi Arabia so far, we've only found about 250, and they tend to be very simple like this. A near-perfect ring, quite small, and either just a 4 spokes creating a near-perfect cross, or a T, or simply a bar running across the interior. So very different from the ones in Jordan. When we turn to pendants, the heads tend to be rather different, and the tails as well. Now, as we saw in the case of Jordan, 1,269. In the Harat Khaybar, we've got almost 4,000, and another 2,000 in the Harat Rahat. So they're much more common in these lava fields in Saudi Arabia than in the Jordanian lava field. The form is different as well. The heads tend to be much bigger. In this case, it's 50 meters across. Tails tend to be longer. In Jordan, 15, 20 meters for these tails consisting of a series of small cairns. In Saudi Arabia, they can be much bigger, commonly 100 meters or so. This one's 115 meters. As you can see, we're now starting to have to use not our aerial photographs, but the imagery from Google Earth. But they can also, in some cases, be quite different in character. Some of the tails, instead of that near perfect straight line we saw in the case of the Jordanian one of those 23 little cairns, you get a tail on a pendant in Saudi Arabia that simply sort of meanders off across the landscape. And then alongside that, you'll find another tail that runs perfectly straight, but for very long distances. The longest I've found so far runs for 9.75 kilometers. And you can lay a ruler on your screen on Google Earth and just simply follow it, from where it starts at the head right the way across to where it finishes. It breaks off occasionally as it goes down through valleys. It picks up again when it starts to go up the next slope. But it continues, and in this case, almost 10 kilometers long. Sometimes the heads have 2 tails on them. Put this up simply to illustrate how things are a little bit different with the pendants in Saudi Arabia, where you can have 2 tails, one of which is meandering, another one is a straight wall, 2 walls in this case, and so on, and a number which are several kilometers long with their tails with breaks along the way, but then picking up and continuing. So one wonders how they, laying out a straight line over 20, 50 meters is one thing, but laying it out over a landscape that's undulating and you can't see where it's going, that's quite a clever trick. And in this case, this is one of 3 that we saw 2 or 3 kilometers apart, but each of these pendants, their tail ran in parallel to one another, so that not only were they able to draw a straight line across the landscape for the wall for several kilometers, but they were doing it in parallel to the next one 2 or 3 kilometers away and the one beyond that. And then there's pendants that are of a type that are found nowhere else except in the Harat Khaybar. Some novel types, which I've given these names trumpet and keyhole types to for reasons that you'll see in a moment. In the case of the Harat Khaybar, they're almost all found along what we have described as funerary avenues. There are tracks that run out from settlements that are very ancient. There's still settlements there today, but they're plainly very ancient settlements. There are these tracks that run out, and all of these pendants are alongside these tracks and are often aligned on them. In the case of the Al Hayat settlement, modern settlement, and underlying ancient remains, these funerary avenues, to date we've measured about 13 kilometres of them radiating out from that one settlement. There's simply a part of one of them near Al Hayat. Here's the track as it is today. It's the ancient funerary avenue, but you can see that there are all of these pendants aligned on it all the way along, plus some a little further away from the track itself. As I say, about 13 kilometres of that around that one settlement alone. And some of them are of a type that is quite distinctive, not just a cairn inside a ring and then a tail, but you've got this bullseye there, and you've got two tails running out, diverging to create a sort of trumpet effect. So we've got three like that here. And in contrast to the types that you find in Jordan, which tend to be like that, these are the types that you find in Saudi Arabia. It's the same type of thing, but a rather different design. And it's the last two there that I'm particularly interested in, simply because of just how very unusual they are. The keyhole pendant, it is there. You can see why we've called it a keyhole from that old-fashioned shape there. And you can see that the wall itself is only about 50 centimetres high as it survives. It probably wasn't much higher when it was initially constructed. That's what it looks like at ground level. Here's what some of them look like on the satellite imagery. Here's the funerary avenue there. Here's a whole range of these pendants, including some of these trumpet ones. But look at these ones here. These are about 54 metres from bottom to top. These two are partly overlying one another. Some of them have got a small cairn inside. And then we've got 5 here, all of which overlap one another. And they're about 40 metres in height from top to bottom. And the drawing, that's that group there, and here's this avenue there. This wider bit of landscape, all of these dots are cairns, and there's a long wall running across it as well. So in this area of about 3 or 4 kilometres long by about 1.5 kilometres wide, there are several hundred funerary monuments, some of them simply very simple cairns, others these very remarkable keyhole-type tombs. We assume that they're tombs, partly because we can't think of anything else that they are. So the entire landscape down here is one that has this funerary avenue, it's got tombs, cairns, and it's got a meandering wall. And the last of the pendants that I want to show you that turns up in Saudi Arabia is this type we call a segmented trumpet. For obvious reasons, you've got the bullseye here with the burial's probably underneath the central cairn there, a ring wall, and then 2 walls diverging as they come away from it, but they've built cross walls to create segments until you arrive at a rather thick cross wall at the far end there. And here you're looking along there, you're looking across the cairn in the middle, that's that, and along the line going off into the distance there of this tail. We found several dozen like that, and what's striking about it is, as you can see here, that unlike almost all of these other structures where it's simply boulders that have been picked up off the surface and heaped on top of one another to create a sort of crude wall, here they've actually shaped some of the stones and they've tried to sort of build a proper wall. So far that's almost unique in any of these structures. In Saudi Arabia, we not only have site types similar to those in Jordan, albeit with different forms, but we have other sites that are completely unknown in Jordan and in some cases found only in particular lava fields in Saudi Arabia. At the beginning, we've got triangles, so named for the obvious reasons that they're almost all an isosceles triangle, and they're in a landscape in which you find the triangle and seldom anything else, except that the point of the isosceles triangle in many cases points to something else. The something else being, as in this case, there's your triangle, is pointing to a bullseye cairn there, but more commonly they're separated. There's a small space between the bullseye and the triangle there. Sometimes a big space, but there's nothing else in the landscape, and the point of the triangle is telling you where to look for the bullseye cairn. Likewise down here with the triangle and the cairn, and even more so here, there's the bullseye cairn and there's the triangle just seeping off the top there. The triangles are quite large, anything between 15 and 30 meters from top to bottom. And as I say, they're not found anywhere else except in the lava fields of Saudi Arabia, or one particular lava field in Saudi Arabia. The last site type I want to mention is one that is unique to this region and is completely baffling as far as I'm concerned. We've called them gates, and they're found almost entirely in the Harat Khaibar there, but there are a few rather poorer examples not too far off, but most of them are concentrated in the Harat Khaibar there. Harat means lava field, incidentally. There's what they look like, and they often come in groups. Trying to think of a name for them when we first encountered these, they look like those old-fashioned things that you got in gymnasia, where you had two handles with these tough springs in between you to try and pull apart. That's what these ones look like, with the handles at either end. But then we started to find others that have 3, 4 wires in between. So we came up with this name gates for them, simply because we wanted something that didn't imply what we thought that they were for, but also because they look like sort of old-fashioned barred gates that had been laid flat, with a post at either end and crossbars linking between them. Want to look at that one, which is a particularly large example. And as you can see, it may not be there much longer. It's being bulldozed. This is all starting to disappear just within the last couple of years. But I also want to look at it because it's one of the few examples where I actually know what it looks like at ground level. I had a fellow countryman who was working at a bank in Saudi Arabia in Jeddah, and he volunteered to go out with his camera to whatever GPS points I gave him, and he'd take photographs for me. So in this case, he went out to this particular gate, and he's taking his photographs in this case from there. He's standing on this great post at one end, with a great thick heap of stones, and he's taking his photograph looking diagonally across the bars. And that's what he saw. So here he's standing on this post, this great heap of stones. It's about 10 meters wide, that post, and the bars are there going up 2, 3, 4, and the bulldozing is taking place out of sight over that rise over there, so that it's a very large one. It's almost 390 meters long, and it's about 70 meters from side to side. What's striking as well in the second photograph is that it's not just heaped stones again. They've actually taken slabs for these bars, and they've set them on edge. By way of discussion, all of what I've been showing you, or almost all of what I've been showing you, is based on remote sensing, on looking at aerial photographs in the case of Jordan, from the flying that we've done in Jordan, and from some groundwork we've been able to do by going and actually looking at sites on the ground in Jordan where it's easy to do so. I've never been to Saudi Arabia or Yemen, much less the neighbouring bits of the Horn of Africa, and probably never will do. So everything I've been showing you about Saudi Arabia is based on what you can see on satellite imagery, and from good fortune I had to have a colleague on the ground to go and take me some photographs then. Much of the searching we've done on the satellite imagery has been done, some of it's been done very systematically and very intensively, so that in the case of kites in Jordan, when I say that we've got 2,590, and I think we've found almost all of them, that's because we've looked intensively at the satellite imagery there. We've probably not missed very much. But elsewhere, we've often had to simply drop into high-resolution windows on the satellite imagery, and look rather randomly to get an impression of what is there. So there's a tremendous amount of work needs done in Jordan for things other than kites, and elsewhere in Saudi Arabia for sites of all kinds to simply map them. Now the Saudis almost certainly knew that they had some of these things there, but there's no proper record of them. Nobody has actually gone through and stuck pins on them in maps or on the satellite imagery in our case. The work we're doing with this project is starting to provide them with information that they can use for their own heritage management. The landscape, as you can see, even there in this very bleak landscape in Saudi Arabia, you can see the trace of what bulldozers have been doing for a number of years, and is only going to get worse. The great pity is if these things are destroyed before anybody's recognised that they're there and recorded them. So that's what we're attempting to do. It would be important, ideally, to be able to go and do some field work as well to go with it. It's unlikely to be me that does that. I'm hoping to get back to my Roman archaeology sometime soon. But it's the sort of work that needs done, and with a bit of luck that will be done in the near future. Now you may ask, when I say the prehistoric, how do I know that? What dating evidence do we have? Well, in the case of some of the kites, we've got some evidence from excavation that's been done by Israeli archaeologists in the Negev, and what are very simple kites. They're just a handful of kites in the Negev, and they're a very simple type, just a small head and two tails running out. And the dating they've got from there is about 5,000 years ago these were being built. In the case of Jordan, there's been some work done there as well, and they're thought to be much older. They're often much more complex than the ones you see in the Negev. And they're thought to be about 9,000 years old, going back to the pre-pottery Neolithic. In the case of the burial cairns, probably somewhere between about 3,000 and 1,000 years ago, judging in part on the evidence that's been coming from excavations in the Yemen before the current civil war blew up. So that gives you some sort of rough absolute dates, but for structures that are spread over a huge area, Arabia, interior Arabia, right the way from northern Syria to the Yemen is about 3 million square kilometers. From the remote sensing project, we can get at least a relative chronology. We can do that by noting that whales, for example, frequently overlie kites, but we never have any examples of a kite on top of a whale, so whales are more recent than kites. Likewise, pendants are often found overlying whales, but you never find the reverse. You never find pendants on top of whales. You never find whales on top of pendants. Likewise with triangles, bullseyes, and kites, we frequently find them overlying gates, but you never find a gate overlying any of these, which has led me to suggest that the broad sequence is for gates to be the oldest feature in the landscape and kites amongst the most recent. The gates, these very puzzling structures, were probably there when people started building wheels and kites and all the other structures round about them. What they're for, they're even more puzzling than most of the other structures, but they're probably the oldest and the most interesting. Now, if you'd like to know a little more about kites in particular, I put together this book some years ago because I wanted to put in large numbers of colour photographs, which are very expensive with a printed book. We made it up as an iBook. There are several hundred colour photographs in it, numerous maps and plans. There's even video and interviews that you can click on and listen to or watch. And it's free. You can download it from iTunes. Unfortunately, the way we had it set up, it will only play on Apple products, so that you can only actually use the book if you've got a Mac laptop or an iPad. But as I say, it's free, and it's well worth having a look through simply to get some idea of the sheer range of kites and all the other structures round about them, most of which I've only had a few minutes to touch on today. But I'll leave it at that and see if you have any questions you'd like to ask about any of these works of the old men. Thank you.